In other news, just 24 hours after being cut from the Democrats' spending bill, a new separate bill to provide $1 billion for Israel's Iron Dome defense system already introduced to the United States Congress, and it's set for a vote later today. Chair of the U.S. House Appropriations Committee, Connecticut Democrat Rosa Delauro, saying that the United States' commitment to the security of our friend and ally Israel is ironclad, and replenishing interceptors used to protect Israel from attacks is our legal and moral responsibility, end quote. Again, though, if every politician felt this way, then the aid likely wouldn't have been cut in the first place. Political analysts therefore awarding the so-called squad with a symbolic victory, adding that it's time to acknowledge how the supposed progressive wing in government holds more influence than it's given credit for. Joining with more is founder and president of the Jerusalem Washington Center, Gideon Israel. Gideon, thanks so much for joining us. Now, what is your initial reaction to the cutting and then reintroducing of this $1 billion in spending?
Well, from an Israeli perspective, I think it was quite odd to see how Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, immediately called Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, to find out what's going on. It seems as if like the Iron Dome, it has more of a central role in Israel's defense doctrine than it should. At the end of the day, it shoots down short-range or mid-range missiles. It shouldn't be such a big deal. Obviously, we want to know what's going on. Why was it cut? Why was it taken out of the bill? But it shouldn't be such a big deal that money for the Iron Dome was cut.
So now, I want to talk a little bit about the squad, as I mentioned earlier. The more liberal elements within the Democratic Party killed the provision for Israel, for this Israel aid in the larger spending bill. So even though a new bill has already been proposed, and it's likely to pass, many are arguing that they have far more sway than they're given credit for. How do you respond?
Well, it wasn't only the squad. I think there were other progressive elements of the Democratic Party who were against it. I think one was, for example, Pramelia Jayapal from Washington State, and other members, I think, of the Progressive Caucus who were also against this. But the reality is that the Democrats have a slim majority. When you have a slim majority and everything passes on partisan lines, then if 4 or 5 or 10 votes aren't there, then the bill dies. So it might be a symbolic victory because of the small majority that the Democrats have. But I think what happened is presents an opportunity for Israel to reassess the aid that they get from America. I mean, the aid that Israel's getting from America is in the same format as it's been for the past 35 years. A lot of things have changed in the past 35 years. Israel's economy is much stronger. In so many ways, Israel is so much stronger. And I think the current way that Israel receives aid in terms of cash coming to Israel, and even though most of it's spent back in the United States, I think it's time for Israel to reassess that aid. It should also be mentioned, I mean, we call it aid, but this is probably one of the better investments of the United States in foreign policy. We saw in Afghanistan how within a few weeks, $90 billion, which is roughly the same amount of money that Israel has received for the past 30 years, went down the drain as the Taliban got hold of all the weapons that were given to the Afghan army. So while we call it aid, it really is an investment, and it's a very good investment for America. Remember, no soldiers in Israel, less presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, so it's a very good investment for America.
All right, and very quickly, I know that the argument comes up all the time about how Israel is supposedly becoming a partisan issue, despite both Republicans and Democrats insisting that support is bipartisan. Is Israel becoming a partisan issue? Because it seems increasingly that it is.
It's not totally a partisan issue, but remember, I think in a recent Pure Gallup poll, it said around 50% of Democrats supported a strong relationship with Israel. So obviously, there's much more Republican support than there is Democratic support. Remember, in 2015, when the Prime Minister of Israel came to the Congress and said that the Iran deal is an existential issue, please vote against it, only 25 out of about 170 Democrats in the House of Representatives voted against it, and only 4 Democrats out of about 48 Democrats in the Senate voted against it. So there's obviously a lot more support from Israel on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. And in addition, we're seeing anti-Israel forces within the Democratic Party are much stronger than they were 10 years ago, not to mention 20 and 30 years ago.
Gideon Israel, thank you so much.
Thank you.